Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents There Was a Light, The Cosmic History of Chris Bell and the Rise of Big Star, by Rich Tupica. Narrated by Chris Abernathy. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche. Prologue. A story of noble, heroic failure. If you're a rock and roll fan, even if you haven't heard of Big Star, you owe them, because I guarantee you, any band you like did hear of them, and listen to them, and do their best to do as well as they did. Mike Mills of REM, 2004 Memphis Heroes Awards induction speech for Big Star. In the 4 decades since the bewildering death of Chris Bell, the steady drumbeat of plaudits, honors, and credits planting him among the musical influencers of his generation would have given him great solace. Tragically, he died at 27 years old while living at his parents' house, working a dead-end job as a grocery store clerk, and not knowing the recordings he'd leave behind would go on to achieve the goals he'd obsessed over throughout the 1970s. After founding Big Star, the Memphis, Tennessee-born guitarist/vocalist led the charge on 1972's highly influential #1 record, produced at Ardent Studios. At his side was a triad of fellow Memphians, including former Box Tops frontman Alex Chilton on guitar and vocals, Andy Hummel on bass, and Jody Stevens on drums. With ample assistance and latitude from Ardent founder John Fry, the assembly of audiophiles perfected a hybrid of beautiful British pop and rowdy American rock. It didn't last long. Shortly after the LP's release, Chris slid into a bout of clinical depression and exited the band. Big Star carried on without him, and, with Chilton at the reins, the band laid down the equally remarkable Radio City, followed by Third, Sister Lovers. Chris recalibrated as a solo artist and produced a sonic boom of poignant material, recorded piecemeal throughout the mid-70s at his home base of Ardent Studios, in London at George Martin's Air Studios, and in France at Château d'Hérouville. Despite valiant efforts in his lifetime, Chris saw few triumphs and received minimal interest in his stockpile of solo recordings. After a succession of snubs from labels, in his final days he even took a job flipping burgers, not the archetypal makings of a future rock and roll legend. Fast forward to today, Grammy Award winners like Wilco and Beck cover his magnum opus I Am the Cosmos in concert, and his international cult following is larger than ever thanks to a series of books, deluxe album reissues, and a Big Star documentary detailing portions of his short, reticent life as a rebellious Memphis songwriter. Carol Ruhlman Manning, photographer, Ardent Studios art designer. Chris died when he was 27 years old. I heard somebody talking about that on the radio one night. It was on a program about all these rock and roll people who died at 27. There was Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, a long string of people, and they included Chris. The tragedy of what happened to him after he left the group, combined with that, it's like he just walked into a template for a rock and roll legend. Terry Manning, Ardent Studios producer, engineer, musician. While Chris was alive, he didn't become a star, but over time he has taken on that status. Whether it's a cult status or beyond that, he definitely made it. For the relatively small output he had, the quality is amazing. Rick Mink, drummer, musician, Matthew Sweet, Velvet Crush. He died young and left a nearly faultless body of work in his wake. He was gifted and flawed, a sensitive young man wrestling with personal demons and expressing his feelings through song. The saddest part is he never got to realize how much his music meant to people. I think he would have appreciated it more than Alex Chilton ever did. Andrea Lyle, Memphis-based journalist. Chris Bell has a different legacy than Alex Chilton because Chris died at 27, whereas Chilton went on to create a discography that was almost the antithesis of what he did in Big Star, playing with Tav Falco's Panther Burns, producing The Cramps, and then putting his own spin on the 1958 Italian pop song Volare. Chris Bell is frozen in time, which makes his music and lyricism that much more beautiful, and his personality that much more impenetrable. Mark Deming, music critic, journalist. Alex had been a rock star before Big Star. He was a charismatic guy, and his crazy life made for good copy. Bell, on the other hand, was a genuinely troubled soul, and I have a hard time imagining he could have a career like Chilton did, even if he hadn't lost his life. I can't see Bell bonding with Paul Westerberg or opening for the John Spencer blues explosion like Chilton did, though I bet the sort of folks who gravitate to Nick Drake or Scott Walker might have embraced Bell if he'd been around longer. Jody Stevens, drummer, Big Star, Icewater, Rock City, Baker Street regulars. Chris's profile has certainly increased over the years. You get on YouTube and all types of things pop up for Chris. That's pretty cool. But Chris didn't make any real money from music while he was alive. He passed away in '78, even before the release of I Am the Cosmos, his solo LP. I don't know exactly how much money having In the Street as the theme song of that '70s show brings in, but it's in syndication, and sometimes it's on 3 or 4 times a night. I wish I would have had a share of that song. Rick Nielsen, guitarist, songwriter, Cheap Trick. Right before that '70s show debuted, they wanted either the Big Star song or Surrender by Cheap Trick as its theme. They picked the Big Star song. After the first season, the producers said, "Can Cheap Trick do a version of it?" John Fry, Ardent Records founder, engineer, Big Star's executive producer. When Fox came up with that '70s show, their music supervisor decided In the Street off Big Star's first album was the tune that typified the '70s. Andrea Lau. I thought Big Star's popularity might peak with that '70s show, but their legacy has just grown and grown over the last few decades, and rightfully so. Chris Bell and Alex Chilton produced some incredible material together. Bob Mayer, Memphis-based journalist, author. Trouble Boys, the true story of the Replacements. Even as Big Star is now, I don't know that the average Memphian on the street knows who Chris Bell is. At the same time, there is an awareness of Chris now within the city that's dramatically, exponentially more than it was even a few years ago. Back in 2008, on the 30th anniversary of his death, I wrote a story about Chris that ran in the daily newspaper in Memphis on A1, the cover of the paper. At the time, there were non-music people who knew Chris, those who went to school with him or whatever, who were totally surprised and perplexed that a story about him would be on the front cover of the Commercial Appeal. They had no idea he was someone who was so highly regarded nationally and internationally, or that he had any level of fame or notoriety. In the years since, with the Big Star box set Keep an Eye on the Sky, the I Am the Cosmos reissues, the Big Star documentary, and all the local press about those releases, Memphians have a better sense that Chris was and is an important artist. While Chris's entire catalog of music has been issued over the years, most exhaustively on Omnivore Recordings' 2017 complete Chris Bell box set, his private life remained an unknown tale. Filmmakers Drew DiNicola and Danielle McCarthy Bowles experienced firsthand the secrecy surrounding Chris while interviewing his friends, family, and bandmates during the making of 2012's Big Star, Nothing Can Hurt Me documentary. Drew DiNicola, director, Big Star, Nothing Can Hurt Me. It was a major problem getting people to talk about Chris Bell for the film. We went around to scout out and find people who would be able to tell us more because everyone was very guarded about Chris. We didn't know if it was about his sexuality or if they were just troubled by the story itself. On the one hand, it seemed like there was this big conspiracy cover-up. It was like, what's going on in Memphis? Nobody wants to talk to us about Chris Bell. To some degree, that was true. Another thing was that the guy was mysterious, even to people who knew him for years. I definitely had people say, I won't talk about his sexuality. If you ask me, I will walk out. We had to lay down rules for the interviews sometimes. We also had to rely on a lot of conversation off camera to help us form what we would try to get on camera for people. In the end, we were like, we're not here to out this guy. We're here to tell the story and how it relates to the music. Danielle McCarthy Bowles, film producer, Big Star, Nothing Can Hurt Me. The film introduced a lot of people to Chris Bell, and a lot of people who knew Chris Bell were just so appreciative we focused on him. It seemed to be more of a revelation for people about Chris. That was surprising for us. His story is more of a tragic, heartstrings-pulling story. His struggle to be heard as an artist, his issues with his sexuality, and his early death. At the screenings, many times I heard people crying during the Chris Bell parts. I heard people sobbing. It touched a nerve. Personal demons and ambiguities aside, Chris's solo recordings and the entire Big Star catalog have become known as some of the earliest prototypes for alternative rock. Even the promotional methods employed by Ardent to support the band foreshadowed the DIY ethos embraced by countless 80s and 90s indie rock bands and labels. Drew DiNicola. The Big Star story is all about sticking to your guns and doing things your way. Not being part of the mainstream, but having contempt for the mainstream. Snubbing your nose at the mainstream. Destroying yourself rather than being a part of the mainstream. Driving yourself insane because you feel left out, but at the same time choosing not to be a part of it. That became the dominant attitude in alternative and indie rock. They were doing that before the rest, having that attitude and being a part of the world of outsiders, rejects, and beautiful losers. Barney Hoskins, British music journalist, author. It's a story of noble, heroic failure. A band that, in a parallel rock critic universe, was as big as the Beatles. The music borrows from 60s pop, but twists it into something so distinctive and, at moments, so heartbreakingly strange. It's almost like they were great because they didn't quite know what they were doing. Or did they? Sherman Wilmot, Memphis-based fan, Shangri-La Records founder. In the 70s, when Big Star was playing here in Memphis, which wasn't often, they were not well known, so the shows were not well attended. There was so much other music going on, they fell through the cracks. There's always been a lot going on here. When I think of Memphis music, I go all the way back to jug band music, and then Willie Mitchell and Booker T and the MGs. There's a broad spectrum of history here, and Memphis puts it in your face. But the 80s were not good for the Memphis music scene. We had to start from scratch. By the 90s, things got better with bands like Big Ass Truck, The Oblivions, and 68 Comeback. They fought against this whole idea that Memphis is only about Elvis and music from the 50s. Even in the 90s, people could still not understand how a band from Memphis could sound like the Grifters, or 10 years later, Jay Reatard. Now the battle is won. You can be from Memphis and not be rockabilly or blues. Great bands can come from Memphis and not sound like Charlie Feathers, Elvis, or B.B. King. Big Star was early proof of that. Drew DiNicola. The Memphis music community is strong, legitimate, and true. Big Star is totally a part of that world. People from Memphis don't like to compromise. They have an island mentality, but it's a beautiful thing. Stax had Booker T and Otis Redding. Royal Studios had Al Green. All these studios had their people, the artists who made them what they were. Big Star is that for Ardent Studios. Robert Gordon, Memphis-based journalist, author, filmmaker. Over time, as Big Star's recognition has come, it's only further implanted Big Star into the Ardent mythos. If you talk to any of the employees there, within minutes, Big Star's influence will come up. Andrea Lyle. Having Ardent here in Memphis is fantastic. It has brought so many successful working bands to town, groups like REM and The Replacements, going all the way back to ZZ Top, and then more recent bands like the Raconteurs. It's extremely validating to drive past and say, oh, that's where Led Zeppelin mixed Zeppelin 3. Robert Gordon. Ardent was a direct reflection of its owner, John Fry. It was about clean sounds and clean, state-of-the-art equipment. Fry was an engineer and interested in sonic clarity. Ardent has always reflected that and has been on the cutting edge of technology. Sherman Wilmot. In the early 2000s, when Rolling Stone came out with its 500 greatest albums, Big Star was the most obscure band to have 3 in the top 500. Being a Memphis guy, it was a real eye-opener for me. It's when I more fully grasped the outside of Memphis perception of the band To have one album in that list would be an achievement, but it's mind-bending for a band that played so few times and sold so few records to accomplish that. Carol Ruhlman Manning. John Fry said the resurgence of Big Star just happened. Drew D. Nicola. It happened organically. It was a total surprise to Ardent. Jody Stevens. What brought that all about was the guys in REM mentioning the band early on. Paul Westerberg writing the song Alex Chilton, Greg Dooley with the Afghan Wigs mentioning the band. A lot of folks kept putting the name out there. People started picking up on it and seeking out tapes. Outside the mentions in the press, it was basically people just passing tapes around, one guy digging it and passing it on to his friend. That's probably why it took 20 years. Steve Rea, classmate, musician, songwriter, Christmas Future, Icewater. There was a network of rock writers all over the world who loved Big Star. It was through them the band's following grew. All the contacts were like a root system of people who loved the music. The rock writers are historians for music that's not only popular now, but for music that has legs, music that has longevity. Big Star came back around 30 years later because the music has something. It was unique, and the rock writers recognized that, even if the music companies didn't. Sherman Wilmot. Things picked up, and they are no longer a cult band in my mind. There are always new people discovering Big Star, and it's a good starting point for some great other Memphis music, like the Scruffs or the Chris Bell solo record. It's a great stepping stone. I've been a fan for over 30 years, and I'm still a sucker. Drew Fortune, journalist, author. In 2016, I interviewed Paul Westerberg of The Replacements at his home in Edina, Minnesota on a freezing Valentine's Day weekend. After playing me some music in his basement studio, Paul and I were pretty comfortable together. I scanned his CD collection, noticing weird ones like Buck Cherry, though that one probably belongs to his son Johnny, but I noticed Big Star too. As I had always wondered, I asked if Alex Chilton was his musical hero. Nah, Paul scoffed. I liked him for those couple years, but I was never wild about him. I like Gene Vincent and the way he looked. I like Johnny Thunders. This admission caught me off guard, as I figured Westerberg worshipped to a Chilton shrine in his bedroom every night. That was all I got on Chilton, and I didn't press. In a sense, it's kind of the perfect tribute to Big Star. Paul penned a love letter, and one of his best songs, to a guy he didn't absolutely cherish. Big Star is so good that even if you're not a diehard fan, the songs can touch you in a place that most bands can't begin to navigate. Today, there are legions of Big Star fans across the world, many of whom found the band via The Replacements. But longtime Bell Chilton fans knew the band was special back in the 1970s, in the prime of their obscurity. Chris Morris, journalist, music critic. The people who stumbled on the Big Star albums early on were thinking, this wasn't successful. Why? Ivo Watts Russell, 4AD Records founder, musician, This Mortal Coil. I picked up Big Star's #1 record and Radio City around 1975 in a sweet shop on the East End of London. They had a box of American imports set out on the counter. I also scored the other Ardent Records releases, Cargo and the Hot Dogs, at this place. They didn't typically sell records there. Clearly they were off the back of a lorry. It was by total chance I found them. It does fan the flames of infatuation when you've heard an album as good as #1 record and no one else has heard it, and you can't find it anywhere. Rick Mink. The first time I recall hearing about Big Star was back in the early 70s, when I read a glowing review of Radio City in, I believe, Crawdaddy magazine. I recall reading reviews in Rolling Stone, and maybe Circus as well. The problem was that it was incredibly difficult to find copies of the album in the Chicagoland area, which is where I grew up. It took a year or two before I could track it down. When I did finally find them, both Big Star albums were everything I imagined, and more. I was instantly smitten. What made them even more beguiling was that it was nearly impossible to find out any information about the band. All I had to go on were the reviews and the album covers, which I would cradle in my arms and stare at for hours on end. Matthew Sweet, singer, songwriter, musician. There was no Wikipedia for Big Star. You couldn't learn about them unless you knew people who knew about them. There were a few magazines like New York Rocker Magazine and Trouser Press where you could learn some about them, but that's about it. The first time someone told me about them was in the early 80s. I was 16 or 17 and worked in this record store in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I grew up. It was an after-school and weekends job at Dietz Music. This rockabilly guy with a great record collection came in and heard some of my demo recordings. He told me, "You would really like Big Star." Mike Mills, bassist, vocalist, REM, Big Star's third. REM was just getting started. I was in college, still trying to sort out all the things you're trying to sort out in college. We were just starting our band, just beginning to write songs and trying to figure out how to go about that. Big Star was always an inspiration. If not exactly a template, then close to it. I felt closer to it than the Beatles. The Beatles were something I heard as a kid on my tiny AM radio. They were from England, and I was very young. It was this in-the-sky thing that I loved, but I wasn't even sure why. By the time I heard Big Star, I was a musician, and I knew what they were doing and why it was so much more personal to me. I felt a lot closer to the music. It felt like something I could do. The Beatles, I don't think I could ever do anything like that. But with Big Star, I thought, I could aim for that. I could do something that might be close to that. Matthew Sweet. They were important to me when I was starting to write songs. Early on, I scored a couple Big Star tapes. The first thing that struck me was the guitar playing. At that age, I grew up on British acts like Elvis Costello, Generation X, and the Buzzcocks, the bands that made power pop-ish kinds of records during that punk and new wave invasion. I was looking for American artists that I related to. That's why I started getting New York Rocker Magazine and learned about the DBs and the first REM 45. I mail-ordered these records. When I was older and had success with Girlfriend in the 90s, a lot of people were going crazy for Big Star, like Teenage Fan Club. I always loved them, but never got to be a part of that scene. I loved Big Star, but some of those bands wanted to be Big Star. Chris Morris. Younger generations of bands have followed along that post-Beatles neo-pop rock path. As a result, the sound has never gone away. It's just gone through these various permutations. You've got the Posies, the Replacements, and Teenage Fan Club, all the acolyte bands that have carried that torch. That sound has always been present, but it's been continuously updated and amplified. Those Big Star records are so present for me that chronology doesn't come into play when I'm listening to them. They are contemporary for me, which maybe makes me fucked up. Alex Chilton, singer, songwriter, guitarist, Box Tops, Big Star, Panther Burns. I'm continually surprised that people fall for Big Star as they do. I would say there was some maudlin strain running through the records that a whole crew of today's youth would identify with, though I'm not particularly one of them. Pete Yorn, singer, songwriter, musician. Very few times have I heard a song and it stopped me in my tracks. I just listened to it over and over, like when Brian Wilson first heard Be My Baby and listened to it repeatedly. I heard I Am the Cosmos, and it just fucking cut right through me. I thought it sounded like some lost Paul Westerberg track. I didn't know what the hell it was. Then I did the research and found out how tragically he died. The thing just hit me. Out of all his songs, that's my favorite. It's a little slower than you think it should be. It has a real emotional fucking intensity that I love, those power pop melodies. When you let a song be a bit slow, it adds this heaviness to a track. Peter Holsapple, singer-songwriter, musician, DBs, REM sideman, solo. A friend from Memphis gave me 2 bootleg cassettes many years ago. One had a version of Third on one side and Big Star's WLIR broadcast on the other. The second cassette was Chris Bell's solo songs in no particular order, with a couple mixes of a few different songs, probably not the whole album because it wasn't released yet. Both cassettes became integral parts of my listening, but Chris's recordings were just monumental to me, like hearing a missing part of Radio City. I will never not sigh when I hear the first chords and notes of I Am the Cosmos. It is truly one of the most perfect songs ever written and recorded. The pain is so evident, the strain on his voice and the ethereal guitar solo. The hand claps were hugely important in my own songwriting, even the little crunch in the tape that made the cymbals break up a little, the yeah, yeah, yeah vocal, and knowing it's the same key as the Beatles' rendering of the same words. It's just magnificent, and it's never gotten any less magnificent over time. Bob Mayer. When Rykodisc released the I Am the Cosmos album in 1992, I was just excited to hear Chris's songs with such great fidelity. I had listened to cassette bootlegs of Chris's Car Records single and some other tracks that had been floating around for years, but to hear those songs properly and to read liner notes by his brother David Bell, it helped answer a lot of questions about Chris and the Big Star story. But at the same time, it also opened a whole new mystery about Chris Bell as this tragic, romantic figure. Act 1. Make a Scene. Chapter 1. The Bells. Beatlemania, 1918 through 1965. The enigmatic roots of Chris Bell and his musical legacy might be firmly entrenched in Memphis's rock and roll folklore, but digging deeper lands you 80 miles south in rustic Oakland, Mississippi, a speck on the map in Yallowbusha County. The rural town of a few hundred is where Chris's father, Vernon Mortimer Bell, born September 2, 1918, was raised. David Bell, brother. Our father, Vernon Bell, was born in Memphis and brought up in this little place called Oakland, Mississippi. It was not even a city yet, just a little stop on the railroad. His mother had problems with her pregnancy, and she died a few days after he was born. Cindy Bell Coleman, sister. Right after he was born, Daddy went to live with his grandparents because his father was a traveling salesman and he had to work on the road, so there was no way he could take care of a baby. They raised him until my grandfather remarried, and by then he had been living with them for years. It was like he was theirs. I've got old photos of Daddy in front of cotton gins down in Mississippi. David Bell. World War II introduced my father to Europe. He was a U.S. B-17 bomber crew member, 134th Bomber Squad in Norfolk, England. That's where he met my mother, Joan Branford Bell. Joan Branford was born in Claydon, Suffolk, near Ipswich, on July 5, 1915, to Ernest Womack Branford and Ethel Louise Pullman. David Bell. Our mother was about 10 years older than her brother. I got the impression she was a little headstrong, a little spoiled. Her nickname was Pinky. She was born in 1915, so she was 10 years old in the middle of the roaring 20s. I remember her telling me she liked jazz, like Louis Armstrong. Cindy Bell Coleman. Daddy met our mother in England while she was working for the military driving a pharmacy truck. Tom Eubanks, vocalist, bassist, guitarist, songwriter, Rock City. Chris was proud of his mother's British heritage. In 1971, when we were recording that Rock City album, we were sitting on his bed working on songs, and he said, "It's so weird. I've never been there, but I'm always homesick for England." David Bell. Growing up in Memphis, all of us as kids heard from our friends how they wanted to come over and hear our mother talk. They were thrilled by her English accent. Terry Manning. Chris loved his mother to death and was proud of her Britishness. He saw himself as half British. Cindy Bell Coleman. Mom was proper. She would be gardening, non-stop gardening. I don't know how she did it. She was bound and determined to create an English garden in our backyard. Sarah Bell, sister. That's what she worked on from the time she got us off to school to the time she started to get dinner ready. David Bell. My older sister Virginia and I were both born in Norfolk in England, and we lived there for a while. At the end of the war, my father said, "I'm going back to America, and you're coming along with me." Chris wasn't born yet. We left on Christmas Day in 1945 from either Glasgow or Edinburgh. We were on board what was called a Liberty ship. They were apparently described as rust buckets. My mother was bedridden with seasickness for the entire crossing. I was about 2 months old when we arrived in Memphis. We lived in an apartment for maybe a year. Cindy Bell Coleman. Mother told me it was a lovely apartment, especially for being...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?